The following tales were written by Samson. The first was written in 1975 and the second in 1980, just before Morrow discovered Samson and Joseph making love. Both stories were recited to Morrow during the years in which they were written, and upon request during her adolescence. The chair. Adam woke up slowly. He had been dreaming of his birthday cake. In less than an hour there would be an event, one loud with the sounds of elegant people in fine clothes enjoying music. If all went as planned, he would turn 15, and a wealthy lady from far away would be shipped to him for marriage. Were his father to die before his 15th birthday, he would have inherited the palace and otherwise dictated the ceremony. Nonetheless, he would have to endure his age. Would he had often wondered, have been dragged to the chair in his father's absence? Expecting to find its master in bed, Adam was reminded of the bliss from waking under a down quilt, as one's mind might create the sensation of a phantom pain after having traumatically lost a limb. He smiled, rolled his head from one shoulder to the other, and rubbed his right index finger against his thumb. Happy thoughts about men with smiles on their mouths coated with cream frosting made him grin in amusement. He opened his eyes. All was dark and silent. Nothing could be distinguished by Adam's senses, save for the coldness of the air and frozen beads of sweat appearing between his body and the chair. Outside, men and women walked toward the palace. Thin trees whose bark had been drawn with charcoal stood grabbing up at the moon, their outlines enhanced by its light. Leaves and moss lay draped over the trees, and from a distance one could see specks of flames carried by Adam's guests as they approached the celebration. Laughter could be heard, and beneath that, a hum of quiet whispers. Impatiently and inappropriately heading the crowd were two young men, Peter and John. Peter looked upward, gazing at the palace. "I've heard he spends most of the celebration in some sort of chair." "Watching over the festivities?" asked John. "No, he's in another chamber, sitting in a chair." John's brows furrowed. "Is it a very comfortable chair?" "Well," began Peter. Thud. Peter rubbed his forehead, embarrassed at the laughter rising in the crowd upon striking the drawbridge pole. He was somewhat thankful that he didn't need to make up a lie to explain the welt on his head. John, who struck the parallel pole, walked unfazed into the palace as the drawbridge rose behind him. He took note of the palace's austerity and let his mind wander to visions of a beautiful chair, mahogany and purple velvet. Soon he would eat and drink while Adam remained in the chamber. After the guests had reached their destinations and wait for the king, all was quiet. Adam heard two figures creep from behind his chair to someplace far away. He could not see the figures. He could only hear their footsteps and smell their sweat. The fragrance was strangely pleasant. He bit the inside of his lower lip and clenched his toes and eyes. He was eager and scared. The smell of the sweat stayed in his nostrils, and he felt the metal seat of his chair grow warm, then hot. Lost in pain, his mind stopped dwelling on the smell of the figures. His hands grabbed at their corresponding armrests, his chin jutted forward, and his wrists attempted to rise, only to strike steel. Then the seat cooled, and he opened his eyes and searched for light. There was none. The footsteps quieted, and he heard men whisper. He thought to ask the men a question about what mechanism generated heat in the chair, but his lips would not open, and he reckoned this was why he had not screamed when the chair pained him. He wondered why he had not tried to part his lips earlier, why he had not attempted to call for someone, why he had not quelled his nerves by singing a pleasant song. From the room full of guests, Adam heard laughter and the thuds of feet striking the brick floor in merriment. The sounds were delightful, and he was happy for those that were free and gay. The guests were even more pleased. At the center of the room was a man playing a tambourine, another his bagpipes, another his fiddle. Young men danced, their legs kicking and their arms folded, sometimes thrusting forward, only to fall and fold in rhythm to the music. Everyone's skin, lit by candlelight, glowed. Each person was seen through a haze of tobacco smoke. John, afraid he had earlier displayed himself a fool, said loudly and knowingly, "It's a peculiar thing, that chair and chamber." Peter's eyes widened. "Yes," he agreed, his lips red-rimmed with wine. He was about to weigh in on the significance of custom when the word chair was spoken by two loud, elderly men seated behind him and John. John and Peter set down their forks and wine glasses. "Even so," began one elder, "it is improbable that one could venture through life without once asking, 'Would I give in?'" "I suppose you're right, and what an honor it is to be given such a grave opportunity. To find out whether one would give in, to become a martyr for one's desire, or for one's people. That is a fine question to have answered. Still, the chair is frightening. Oh, but of course, I certainly wouldn't wish such a truth on myself." The music stopped, and so did the elderly voices. A jester entered from the main hall, playing a hurdy-gurdy and singing a comedic poem, its delivery more or less inaudible, its mood distinguished by horrendous smiles and expressions of mourning. Adam could hear traces of the music and poem, and was no longer happy for the free and gay. The figures that had crept from behind his chair were still whispering, and he wished he could open his mouth to quiet them. Footsteps clattered. He shut his eyes, afraid the figures might approach. Then, startled by the thud of falling curtains, his eyes reopened. His chamber took on the pale blue hue from outside. The cake re-entered his thoughts, and he looked forward, gazing at the outlines of two men of intimidating muscle, of low brow lines and high cheekbones, the eyes between them unseen. Warmth spread through Adam's seat, and his eyes darted toward the ceiling, beneath which 7 segment skeletal appendages hung twitching above his head, their ends obscured by the darkness. From the shadows, footsteps rose and fell in volume. In the blue-hued din, hands raised and his mouth open in silent protest, he was undressed by the figures. John and Peter, meanwhile, struggled against an alcohol-induced coma. They watched the jester leave and the musicians return playing the tambourine, bagpipes, and fiddle. "I wish those old men would start talking about the chair again," sighed Peter. John sipped at his wine. "I figured you already knew all there is to know about the chair and the chamber." "It's not my fault," began Peter, at which point the two stood and sang, "I know everything there is worth knowing." One of the old men kicked the seat of John's chair into the back of his knees, and he fell hard, spinning onto the floor. The two friends laughed. Then, complete silence. The guests' attention was diverted to an enormous 5-layer cake being pulled into the dining hall. John's face lifted only slightly off the ground to see the cake. He licked his lips and motioned to Peter to retrieve his fork. Peter paid no mind, himself transfixed by the cake. Covered with white frosting, each layer lined with ganache, the guests displayed their lust for the cake with abandon. They were ravenous, and they gazed at the object of their longing. Some guests became momentarily aware of their vulgar desire for the confection, yet detecting no disapproval from the other guests, were relieved that their response was ubiquitous. The keen musicians gestured and guests breathed lustily, gripping whatever they could, their throats working hard to choke down torrents of saliva. No one waited for the taster, and anxious servants forced to cut and serve the cake inconspicuously lapped the bits of stray frosting on their fingers. The whole of them ate ravenously, and when the cake was gone, they talked about how good things never last. The music resumed, and Adam listened. His eyes were closed. Darkness had become a comfort, as the chair did not seem to punish him so long as he kept his eyes closed. The figures maintained their distance. He imagined the cake again, snickering at the thought of men with smiles on their faces and mouths coated with frosting. The music could be heard, but there was no sound of merriment to accompany it, only the silence of gluttons too full to move. Adam longed to view his guests, to see how much they enjoyed the cake he helped prepare. Then, a thud. Moments later, a scream. Then another thud, and another. More screams and more thuds. Adam saw images of the cake projected onto his closed eyelids. He thought of asking the figures to help him, but remembered they had not been moved by the pain in his eyes when his skin blistered and his clothes were removed. He rubbed his fingers together. The air was damp and he was cold. He felt tired and confused. Peter, taking hold of his stomach, looked to John. "I think we're next," he said. "Next to what?" asked John, his face soaked in tears, his lips coated with frosting. Peter gestured to a more recent corpse. John laughed. "Ah. It's too bad we never got to really talk about the chair." "Yes," John's eyes widened, still afraid of his full ignorance being discovered. "But it's like the old man said, some truth shouldn't be wished on anyone." Adam heard another thud. His eyelids tightened. The guests were just about completely dead, and Adam contemplated whether it would be better to gaze in pain or live his life with closed eyes.